all of the people who've declared Georgia's voting laws are repressive are all in for China. Wilkow starts now. Welcome to the program. I'm Andrew Wilkow. There's absolutely nothing racist about securing the ballot through voter ID laws, secure drop boxes, and preventing electioneering at the polls. You know, if you were to present such a plan to a diverse group of voters by simply stating, first, you didn't want anyone to be able to steal their vote through fraud, and second, you wanted to protect ballots once cast from ne'er-do-wells, and this one, really important, third, preventing individuals and groups from trying to influence or intimidate voters at the polls, you'd probably have near to 100% approval. That is unless you're a group of Republicans in Georgia and you're up against the whole of the left, including the media. We went from nonpartisan to racist like that. As the Democrats try to federalize voter fraud with H.R. 1 SB 1 laughingly called the For the People Act, the American left has now declared war on the Georgia state government led by Republicans for daring to secure the ballot. In Major League Baseball now wants to join the ranks of the NBA and the NFL. Whatever happened to the left thinking that the athletes were just a bunch of dumb jocks? But now they're social justice warriors. So the MLB is going to break off and move the All-Star game out of Georgia.
Yesterday, Major League Baseball caved to fear and lies from liberal activists. They ignored the facts of our new election integrity law, and they ignored the consequences of their decision on our local community. Georgians and all Americans should know what this decision means. It means cancel culture and partisan activists are coming for your business. They're coming for your game or event in your hometown. And they're coming to cancel everything from sports to how you make a living.
MLB unveils partnership to help grow game in China. America's pastime, right? Then there's the weak-kneed C-suiters at Wilkow and Delta Airlines, literally the symbol for change. Now, if Home Depot decides to bend like cheap PVC, we'll call them Hope Depot so we can have hope and change. You see what I did there? But they haven't. They haven't for now. But the others have. They've all caved to the party that actually wants to raise their taxes. Did any of these woke CEOs even read the bill? You know the answer. But virtue signaling is the currency of the left. Watch as the Delta CEO whimpers like a puppy who just wet the floor.
President Biden has called this bill Jim Crow of the 21st century. Critics are suing. Organizations are saying that it suppresses the black vote. So it's unacceptable to you now. What changed?
Well, we've been working with the legislature here in the state capitol for the last couple of weeks, and it's been very frustrating. The early versions of the proposed bill had some really toxic and very suppressive elements to it. The final bill still is not acceptable, as I mentioned in my note this morning, but we are going to continue to work to make change happen, not just here in Georgia, but throughout the U.S., joining arms with many in corporate America, because our black community's voices need to be heard on this topic.
Now, what about China? Well, there's 450 million reasons why he'd never speak like that about China. China Eastern and Delta solidify strategic partnership. $450 million investment connects the two complementary airline networks. On any other day, that guy, he'd be the guy that oversees an anti-climate agenda fleet of carbon-spewing, earth-killing death machines. Up next, the CEO of the beverage company responsible for childhood obesity.
Let me be crystal clear and unequivocal. This legislation is unacceptable. It is a step backwards, and it does not promote principles we have stood for in Georgia around broad access to voting, around voter convenience, about ensuring election integrity. And this is frankly just a step backwards.
Boy, he's bubbly. According to the company's website, though, the Coca-Cola system is currently investing $4 billion in China for future growth from 2015 to 2017, building on the $9 billion of investments made in the market since 1979. The Coca-Cola system today employs more than 45,000 people in China, 99% of whom are local hires. Which brings us to the man who promised he'd be the president for all Americans, Joe Biden. After a series of lies about the Georgia voting law, he tried to hit us with a metaphor for just how terrible, awful, no good this is.
What I'm worried about is how un-American this whole initiative is. It's sick. It's sick. Deciding in some states that you cannot bring water to people standing in line, waiting to vote. Deciding that you're going to end voting at 5 o'clock when working people are just getting off work. Deciding that there will be no absentee ballots under the most rigid circumstances. And so I'm convinced that we'll be able to stop this because it is the most pernicious thing. This makes Jim Crow look like Jim Eagle. I mean, this is gigantic.
Jim Eagle. Jim Eagle. You get it, right? Jim Crow wasn't an actual crow, but a crow is a small, low-flying bird versus the eagle, right? Jim Eagle, that is. This is all bad. Really bad. Like a law to keep all black people from the polls bad. For the record, it's actually harder to vote in Joe Biden's own Delaware. You see, Wes Cantrell, a Georgia State Assemblyman and a Republican, he put this up on his Facebook page. The bill will be called the President Joe Biden Jim Crow on Steroids Voting Act, since President Biden seems to be very concerned about our laws here in Georgia. This bill will make Georgia's voting laws identical to those of his home state of Delaware. As a result, it will have 5 key features. 1, instead of having up to 19 days of early voting in Georgia, we will have 0 days of early voting, just like Delaware. 2, instead of having no excuse absentee voting in Georgia, you will have to have the excuse of being sick or disabled to vote absentee, just like Delaware. Number 3, instead of having plenty of secure drop boxes in Georgia, there'll be no drop boxes, just like Delaware. Number 4, instead of being able to get drink, food from a non-poll worker outside of the 150-foot buffer and drink from a poll worker within the barrier in Georgia, it will be illegal to receive anything of value while standing in line to vote, just like Delaware. And 5, instead of being able to vote in relative quiet in Georgia, your name will be announced out loud and your party affiliation during a primary so that your vote can be challenged by anyone in the precinct, just like Delaware. Well, how do you compete with the truth? Well, cue up the political theater. Here's Park Cannon, also a member of the Georgia State Assembly and a Democrat who just wanted to bear witness to the signing of this horrible, awful, racist law.
Yeah, you said you give her one more time, like you're going to do something. Are you serious?
No, you are not.
There it is. There it is. The perfect optic of white police officers dragging a black woman off to the gulags or something. For the record, I interviewed Governor Kemp on my SiriusXM radio program, and he told me that if she really, really wanted to be in the room, all she had to do was have her staff make the arrangements before the signing. But who cares? They got their moment, right? They got their setup moment. So it must be true. This is the most restrictive anti-minority voting law ever. Headline, our own TheBlaze.com. Washington Post hits Biden with 4 Pinocchios for whopper about new Georgia voting law, a blatant lie. In the fact-check article, Kessler found that the law put no such restrictions on voting. In fact, Kessler acknowledged the new law maintains the current Election Day voting hours of 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. and actually expanded voting hours and days for early voting. So where would Biden get this perception that ordinary workers were getting the shaft because the state would end voting at 5 o'clock? He wrote, going on to pummel the president for openly misinforming the American people about the new law. One could understand a flub at a news conference, but then this same claim popped up in an official presidential statement. Not a single expert we consulted who has studied the law understood why Biden made this claim, as this was the section of law that expanded early voting for many Georgians. Somehow, Biden managed to turn that expansion into a restriction aimed at working people, calling it among the outrageous parts of the law. There's no evidence that this is the case. The president earned 4 Pinocchios. So, what else does this law do or not do? Not only does the law codify drop boxes, which were previously illegal, it also provides for round-the-clock surveillance. But let's take up the issue of the water. The law does not prevent people from getting water while they wait in line to vote. What the law does is prevent political or interest organizations from handing out refreshments 150 feet from the polling location. So that means, as Governor Kemp has stated over and over, that the NRA cannot hand out snacks to voters. What the law does do is allow, and this is a key word here, allow nonpartisan members of the Board of Elections to provide the water or snacks inside the 150-foot zone. Well, what is racist then? Well, it's whatever the activists and the Democrats and the media say it is. There's no standard anymore. Expecting everyone to follow the same rules is now racist. And that brings me to voter ID. Apparently, voter ID laws unfairly burden POCs. That's people of convenience, which must mean not a single person darker than me has ever attended the Democratic National Convention or the state convention or even a Stacey Abrams rally. But that doesn't stop her.
Well, first of all, I do absolutely agree that it's racist. It is a redux of Jim Crow. In a suit and tie. We know that the only thing that precipitated these changes, it's not that there was a question of security. In fact, the Secretary of State and the governor went to great pains to assure America that Georgia's elections were secure. And so the only connection that we can find is that more people of color voted, and it changed the outcome of elections in a direction that Republicans do not like. And so instead of celebrating better access and more participation, their response is to try to eliminate access to voting for primarily communities of color. And there's a direct correlation between the usage of drop boxes, the usage of in-person early voting, especially on Sundays, and the use of vote by mail, and a direct increase in the number of people of color voting.
And yet again, not a problem in Biden's home state of Delaware. Just like any attempt to secure the borders portrayed as racist, so too is any effort to stop voter fraud. Voter fraud? There's no such thing as voter fraud. There's no such thing as voter fraud. The Democrats and the media declare it over and over and over again. Well, unless when a Democrat wins. I mean, that is according to the New York Times. There is no, I repeat, no evidence of voter fraud. See, look right there. They called every state election official around the country. No voter fraud. All the big corporate pro-Democrat media companies have lined up behind this notion. Nope, no way, no such thing as voter fraud. Except for here. And here. And here. And here. Here. And here. Now, I could stand here and do this all day. That's just a few examples. I can go on and on. But you get the point. So there is voter fraud. Oh, but it's not widespread. Not enough to change the outcome of an election, they say. But it is there. We keep hearing about the 200,000 or so Georgians without ID. The 2019 census reported that Georgia has over 10.6 million residents. So, should Georgia, A, get those without an ID, the free ID, it's free, that the state promises, or B, have no one show ID? I think you know the answer. This is about the time that I make the turn to finish the argument. Now, you're not going to believe this, but the man who paid for the Steele dossier, Mark Elias of the infamous Perkins Coie law firm, who judge shopped his way into the courtroom of Stacey Abrams' own sister to affect Georgia voter law in the run-up to the runoff elections, actually put this up on Twitter. Brace yourself. The new Georgia voter law require voters to submit ID to vote by mail if they use their driver's license. They need to provide the number. One of the two numbers below is correct. If they put the other, it will be rejected. Are you sure you would pick the right one? No, wait, hold this graphic right there for a second. You see that? You see that? Look right there. Look. See that thing? It's at DLNO, right there. That stands for driver's license number. Here's the argument. The Georgia voting laws are not at all racist. Maybe the woke corporations and sports leagues ought to look at the people they're making deals with in China before declaring Republicans in Georgia are repressive. What should be considered racist is the assumption that somehow minorities are in some way deficient of the ability to get a legal, free legal ID and fill in the ID number to vote by mail. Instead of listing all of the things one must show ID to gain access to, why don't we try thinking of all the things we don't have to show ID for when interacting with government and business? We continually hear the phrase civic participation and civic duty when referring to voting. Well, part of participating is actually involving oneself. There are no laws in Georgia or any state for that matter that prevent people from voting due to their race or socioeconomic status. That would be unconstitutional. But part of doing your duty is participating, taking it upon oneself to be involved. That means doing your best to register yourself, to have proper ID. And in Georgia, again, it's free. Then you got to show up to vote or at least cast your ballot provisionally to know who and what you're voting for. That's part of it. Not to mention, actually, this is crazy, filling out the ballot properly. I know. How evil and discriminatory. Try to imagine if we applied all of these ideas to, let's say, tax paying. You know, we can't even simplify our tax code. And we can't exercise our Second Amendment rights without civic participation. We can't even borrow a book from the library or collect Social Security without participation. No matter what we are talking about, the only thing we get from Democrats is, that's racist. Well, dear woke, if everything is racist, then nothing is racist. Treating people equally under the law, definitely not racist. To end here, Mark Hamill. Mark Hamill has joined the boycott of Georgia. Headline, Mark Hamill and James Mangold push filming boycott in Georgia in response to newly passed election integrity law. All right, Luke Skywalker. May the farce be with you, always. Okay, joining me now is a guy I've interviewed God knows how many times over the years. Hans von Spakovsky. He's the manager of the Election Law Reform Initiative at the Heritage Foundation and a senior legal fellow at the Mies Center for Legal and Judicial Studies. And he's also been there, done that when it comes to voting and civil rights at the DOJ. Hans, thanks for joining us.
Sure. Thanks for having me on.
All right, let's start with some of these provisions in the Georgia voting law that, if sold to voters, absent of any partisan, naming Republican versus Democrat, I think if you were standing for, and I pointed this out in the monologue, if you were standing before a diverse group of voters and you said, look, we need to make sure that nobody is able to damage, let's say, drop boxes. So we want the County Board of Elections to provide security for them. We don't want people trying to influence or intimidate people voting online while they're waiting to vote online. So we're not going to allow interested parties to have any contact, let's say 150 feet from the polls, and on and on and on. None of these things are partisan in nature, but the Democrats and the media made them sound racist.
They did. And in fact, all of these provisions are things that polling shows a majority of Americans think are a good idea or that are common sense. I mean, another part of the Georgia bill they attacked was Georgia's voter ID law. Well, the polling on that shows that Americans overwhelmingly think, well, of course you should have to show an ID when you vote. And that's the majority of folks, no matter what political party they support, no matter what their race or ethnicity. It's only the Democratic and liberal leadership that is trying to turn that into somehow a racist requirement.
And here's what I don't get when they talk about low income, and for some reason the Democrats and the media are always fusing low income and minority. But in the state of Georgia, for well over a decade, under Governor Sonny Perdue, a Republican, I might add, the ID, the requisite ID to vote, was made free. There's no charge for it. There's no barrier based on socioeconomic status to getting an ID in Georgia. It's absolutely free. How does the left and the media get away with calling this racist when the state says, here, doesn't cost you anything?
Well, because they ignore the evidence, and the media helps them do that. Look, it's not just that the law has been in place for more than a decade, but we've got turnout data from election after election after election. And by the way, Georgia keeps its turnout data based on race. So they know how many black residents, how many white residents turned out to vote. And after the ID law went into effect in 2008, turnout of all voters, including black and Hispanic voters, climbed dramatically. They've had record voter registration numbers. They've had record turnout. But the left just ignores that and keeps repeating this ridiculous claim that requiring an ID is somehow racist.
Stacey Abrams said New Jersey was the model. I live in New Jersey. I voted at a drop box. I live in Morris County, New Jersey. We were told quite clearly that the only acceptable drop box was the one at our town hall next to the police department that was under surveillance. So my wife and I went, we filled out our ballots as properly. We went down and we put them in the official Morris County, New Jersey drop box, which was under surveillance. Should anybody try to tamper with the ballot, they would have been caught by the police. This is now the law in Georgia, where they didn't even have drop boxes previously. But they're now portraying it as racist because not every Tom, Dick, and Harry interested party is able to set up their own drop box.
I know. Again, that's just a ridiculous claim, particularly because, look, every voter has the ability to simply drop their absentee ballot in the mail and mail it back. And anyone who thinks there's not a problem with having unguarded, unsurveilled drop boxes, just go back to the last election and Google the news stories about the fact that mailboxes that were being used to drop absentee ballots into were set on fire in Boston. In Virginia, they had to send out notice because a number of mailboxes in Richmond had been broken into and the mail stolen. And that's because they were using unmonitored U.S. postal boxes to drop off absentee ballots.
If the concern is racism, right? And again, if you were presenting this to a diverse group of voters, you said, look, one of the things we don't want to happen is, let's say, white supremacists putting up fake drop boxes in your community, and then your vote doesn't get counted. I mean, again, if you took all the partisan nature out of this, and it wasn't Republicans who were crafting these laws, if Democrats, if this were bipartisan or nonpartisan at all, if you just presented that example to voters that you didn't want anyone confusing people with these fake, phony drop boxes, I think most people would say, yeah, you know what, we should have a standard here and we should have some kind of security.
Oh, no, I think that is totally correct. And you know, what's so strange about this is that, look, Georgia's election laws in their entirety are pretty much average. They're not that different from states all over the country, and yet they are being focused on. I have to tell you, I actually think, for example, the attitude about voter ID, the people saying that it's racist, it shows that they are being patronizingly racist because what they're saying in essence is that somehow black voters can't cope with a voter ID law. And I think that is a really racist thing to say.
You know, what's funny is that we list all of the things constantly, right? Is constantly list the things that you need to show ID for. I mean, everything from
Right.
buying certain beverages to borrowing a book from the library. If you were to work backwards, you'd find there's probably very few things you don't have to show ID for at this point. Again, in Georgia, it's free. We keep getting this number that 200,000 Georgians don't have proper ID. So my question is, do we, A, get those people their ID, or B, not expect anyone to show ID? And I pointed this out with you on my radio program. If we're lining up people to get a free vaccine for COVID-19 while the people are there, while they're sitting in the chair, why not take their picture and give them the ID right there at the vaccine site? The Democrats love the idea of motor voter. Well, why not vaccine voter?
Oh, no, I totally agree with that. And I think you could do that. But you got to understand that there is no support whatsoever for that 200,000 person number. Keep this in mind. The left, groups like the ACLU and others, made very similar claims when the Georgia voter ID law was first passed back more than 10 years ago. Those claims failed when they actually had to provide proof that supposedly hundreds of thousands of Georgians didn't have ID. When they had to provide proof of that in court, they were unable to do so. That's why the court eventually threw out their lawsuit, because the judge said that after 2 years of litigation, they hadn't been able to produce a single witness anywhere in Georgia who would be unable to vote because of the voter ID law.
One of the more interesting things about the 5 provisions that Wes Cantrell, a Georgia assemblyman, put up when comparing to Joe Biden's own state of Delaware. Biden says this is Jim Eagle, which is a play on Jim Crow, obviously. But he pointed out that in Delaware, your name is announced and your partisan affiliation when voting in a primary. They don't do that in Georgia. He pointed out that there are no drop boxes in Delaware, that early voting is non-existent in Delaware, and you actually need a reason to vote with an absentee ballot, whereas in Georgia, it's no excuse. No excuse needed.
Yeah, no, Delaware has much more restrictive laws than Georgia, but you would never know that from the coverage that you've seen of the whole Georgia election law. By the way, Georgia's laws are very similar to those of Colorado's. And as you know, Major League Baseball pulled out the All-Star game and moved it to Colorado, yet the law between the two states isn't that much different.
And nothing says, racial justice like moving the All-Star game from a city that's almost 50% black to a city that's less than 10% black, right? If that's the goal. So you take all that economic activity out of a city where the population is almost majority at this point black to a city with barely a black population. That makes absolutely no sense. And let me go into this with the woke corporations. It's almost as if the CEOs who are going on TV night after night to talk about how their company's not going to stand for this repression. First of all, they're all in bed with China, but it's almost like none of them actually read this bill. And you know what? I wouldn't blame a CEO for saying, look, my business is airlines or my business is building supplies. It's not my, I believe in voting rights. I think people should be free to vote, but I spend my time, with the bottom line to my shareholders. This is not my lane. That would be okay.
That's in fact what they should do. They should be focusing on their employees and their shareholders and their customers and not getting involved in partisan politics. That's exactly what they did. And it's very clear they hadn't actually read the bill they were condemning. Look, again, on the voter ID provision, I have a friend who practices law in Atlanta, and he told me trying to get into the headquarters of Coca-Cola is like trying to get into the Pentagon. They have much stricter standards than Georgia's apply. Same thing, of course, with Delta Airlines. Obviously, you can't get on a flight without a government-issued photo ID. So they are being monumental hypocrites with their criticism.
It's really scary when our media, and look, the Washington Post did, in fact, call out Joe Biden with 4 Pinocchios, but that's the one moment when when the Washington Post fact checkers aren't being brought on to CNN and MSNBC every night, to explain their reasoning for giving it 4 Pinocchios. It was kind of like they checked the box and moved on. But the Washington Post did in fact say that there was 4 Pinocchios for Joe Biden's take on the voter ID laws. So I don't know when we're going to get the truth out there to the population, but as it stands, there's nothing racist about these voting laws.
No, it's not. And in fact, what Georgia is doing, along with a number of other states, is trying to fix the holes and the vulnerabilities in the system. Look, Georgia's got a history of election fraud, unfortunately, and they need to guard against it. Jimmy Carter, in his first election to the state legislature many years ago, actually had to sue because local county party officials basically stole his election. So there's an unfortunate long tradition of it there. And what this bill does is try to fix many of these problems to try to ensure that doesn't happen again. And by the way, I say that as a former county election official in Georgia.
Wow. All right, Hans, I got to leave it there. Thank you so much for giving us your time and joining us. We'll get you back soon.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
On a side note, apparently, the U.S. Olympic Committee has also decided to go full woke. Headline from the Wall Street Journal. Team USA backs allowing athlete protests at Olympics. U.S. Olympic leaders say they won't punish athletes who advocate for racial and social justice at the Games. The International Olympic Committee bans such displays. Okay, look, we have seen Olympic athletes put on display in the past, back in 1968 to be specific. But now this is sanctioned by the committee, but only if the politics are woke, right? It's not about free speech. It's not about athletes being able to speak their mind on the world stage. It's about whether or not you're woke. Now, I'm wondering, is it going to be allowed if any Americans have a comment about foreign nations and their systems of repression? I don't know. Again, I'm thinking China. I highly, highly doubt it. I don't think for a second that the woke left is going to allow every single American athlete to display their own point of view and their own politics. It's a one-way street here. As long as you're woke, you're good. You know, it wasn't that long ago that most Americans didn't really know who Dr. Anthony Fauci was, but of course that's changed, hasn't it? Steve Deace and Todd Erzin wrote a new book, Fauci and Bargain, the most powerful and dangerous bureaucrat in American history. And in its first week, it's already the #1 best-selling nonfiction book on Amazon. And my good friend Steve Deace joins us right now. How you doing, sir?
Good to see you, Andrew. Thanks for having me back, brother.
All right, let's start with the title, The Most Dangerous Bureaucrat. I mean, here's a guy in the beginning of the pandemic who was telling us we didn't need to wear masks. Then we're told to wear 2 masks. And then we might have to wear masks whether we're vaccinated or not. Now, one of my favorite demotivational posters is meetings. None of us are as dumb as the rest of us. So saying let's do this by committee is not always the answer. But shouldn't we get a second opinion here?
You know, 2 of the bedrocks of our healthcare system is informed consent. So let's start with that. That you are to be given information on what will be ultimately the collateral damage, the risks, et cetera, associated with or with taking action or without taking that action. The American people were not given really informed consent here. They were just said, hey, trust us. We know what we're doing. We are the experts. And here we now are sitting a year later, Andrew, and Anthony Fauci, without a single vote cast, has the power to determine whether you go out and breathe free air or not. Every home, every school, every church, every business in America is under his thumb. No one person, no matter how great they are, how smart they are, should have that kind of power, but especially somebody, as you've already pointed out in your opening question, that's as inconsistent as he is. And another great bedrock of our healthcare system is what you just said, the ability to get a second opinion. One of the things that really has mystified me covering this story for the last year, and we highlighted a lot in Fauci and Bargain, is there's a lot of experts out there. Martin Kulldorff at Harvard, #1 university in America, several experts at Stanford, top 5 medical school in America, Sunetra Gupta, Florida, the Center for Evidence-Based Medicine, an entire department at Oxford. She's with Oxford, too. That's the #1 university in the world. And I could go on and on. Dr. Harvey Risch, Dr. Tony Katz at Yale University, another top university here in this country. These are experts that come from a lot of left-wing institutions, and yet they thought this was all BS. It was flat earth voodoo, these lockdowns, quarantining of the healthy. They have questioned it all along, and yet they've largely been ignored in the last year. Unless you were an expert with a certain narrative, you were listened to. Any other counter experts were never listened to. And Andrew, if you were given a dire diagnosis, someone comes to you and says, hey, we might have to remove a limb or a sensitive part of your body because there's a mass there, I'm guessing before you tell them, go ahead and cut it off, you're probably going to get a second opinion. We never did that.
The name escapes me of the writer, but there was a very far left writer who wrote a very great piece on how dangerous it was to turn Ruth Bader Ginsburg into the notorious RBG. And I feel like the media and the Democrats did that with Fauci, right? They kind of turned him into this quasi-celebrity. He was the super cool doctor guy. He was a good friend to the Cuomo family. And just like the Cuomo bro show between baby brother and the governor, we saw the same interactions with Fauci. All of a sudden, he was this guy that was just too cool for the room. Well, great, but I don't want that in someone who's dictating health policy.
That's exactly right. In fact, we've got an entire chapter in our book called The Branch Covidian Cult. There has clearly been not just a cult of celebrity around Anthony Fauci for all the reasons and examples that you cited. And I think what was driving that is, you know, we had this orange man bad idol that these people worshipped prior to Fauci. And so they needed a counter idol. Hey, Trump's going to kill me, so I need a counter idol of a savior, a messiah. And it was going to be Anthony Fauci. But it's even more than that. I mean, we shared footage. I shared footage on my Twitter account, people using salad tongs to get canned goods at a Whole Foods, people spraying air freshener as they walk through grocery stores, Karens losing their damn minds over not wearing masks outdoors. 2 weeks ago, Andrew, the state of Nevada, a statewide desert, lifted its ban on playing basketball outdoors at a park for a year. They had a ban on going outside in a desert to play basketball, but you could go inside to one of the lung dart havens known as the casinos, take your mask off to inhale and exhale carcinogens while social distancing, of course. This is flat earth voodoo. The amount of people, you know, in previous eras of human history, we've had to convince people to take plague seriously. In our time, we have to convince people not to take it too seriously. It's a little bit like, do not take my end of the world episode of Walking Dead away from me.
Here's what I don't like about the way the media has treated Fauci. When he is presented, and he has been presented evidence that Texas and Florida are no worse off, the non-lockdown states, than New Jersey, New York, and California, he literally has no answer. Right? There should be a scientific response to that. If Texas and Florida are doing the complete opposite of New York, New Jersey, and California, there should be an explanation. He has none.
It's because this hasn't been science all along. Maybe originally it was guesswork in a terrible scenario, and you know you can't really trust the World Health Organization or the Chi-Coms, but I repeat myself with that redundancy. And so you're just trying to make sure, hey, let's ride this thing out in the initial wave and see what we're dealing with until we have our own real-time data. Well, a year into this, Andrew, we have our own real-time data. The median age of death with COVID in America is 78. That's the average life expectancy. Okay, I mean, the current case fatality rate for COVID is just 1.8%. The current infection fatality rate is just 0.18%. Almost half of all deaths in America have occurred in nursing homes where less than 12% of the U.S. population lives. We have all this data now. We know we can document children are not vectors for the virus, and yet still about 40% of American schools are not open for in-person learning. California right now has one of the lowest hospitalization ratios per 100,000 citizens in the country, and yet it sustains one of the worst lockdowns in America. Michigan had one of the worst lockdowns in America. It has the worst hospitalization ratio in America right now. And so the problem he has now is he could run for a while, but now that the real-time data is coming in and people want their damn lives back, now the fact that this isn't based anymore on any kind of science, whatever it's based on isn't science. And so now he's having a hard time defending his narrative.
Look, conservatives, this is not about us versus them, right? Good practices are good practices. Good advice is good advice. We can do sensible things and protect vulnerable people without getting crazy, right? But here's what drives me totally insane about Fauci, the Democrats, and the media. We were told Operation Warp Speed was a joke, right? It was not going to happen. There's no such thing as a vaccine in less than a year. There was multiple vaccines in less than a year. People were getting jabs before Joe Biden became president. But the funny thing is now, all of the credit is going to Biden. And after the media, the Democrats saying this was not going to happen, Fauci says, well, it was my idea. What? Wait. Yeah, hold on a second. You can't say this whole Operation Warp Speed was this big put on. Then it bared fruit. It bore fruit, had fruit happened, whatever way you want to say it. But now Fauci is running around saying, well, it was all my idea now.
You can, when you have been essentially a year-long gaslighting operation from the very beginning. One of the pivotal questions asked in our book is on February 28th of last year, when giving an analysis of SARS-2, that's really what COVID is, it's the second SARS, when giving an analysis of its fatality ratios for the New England Journal of Medicine, he estimated that in the end, it would have a fatality ratio somewhere around a pandemic flu. So people want to know where Trump got the talking point, it's a bad flu. Well, he got it from his infectious disease expert writing in the esteemed Medical Journal of the United States, they're the New England Journal of Medicine. But then 11 days later, he went to Congress on March 11th and said this is going to be 10 times worse than the flu. Its captain trips shut the country down. College basketball, the NBA shut down that night. Concerts did. By the end of the week, the country was shut down. Well, we look here a year later, and when you look at the IFR, the CFR, as we're sitting here today in early April, 3.4% of all ER visits in America. That's right. 3.4% of all ER visits are for COVID-like illnesses. Last year, actually, hospitalizations in America were actually 8.5% lower, Andrew, than they were forecasted at the beginning of 2020 before we knew what a COVID-19 was. So we have all this data in that actually now verifies that Fauci's originally modest risk of COVID assessment has turned out to be accurate and true. So then why did he go to Congress on March 11th, instantly go do an about face, sing a different tune, and begin a year long of gaslighting and panic porning? What changed from February 28th to March 11th? We need to get the answer to that question.
And again, there were some people that felt like, well, if the Democrats are saying we have to do this, then I'm just going to go do that. Again, sensible measures, reasonable caution is really what is in order, right? We know who the most vulnerable are now. We should protect them. Some part of me feels like Ron DeSantis is going to be president, but that's a different topic for a different day. But that was DeSantis leading, right? DeSantis came out front and said, look, we now have some evidence. We now have some data. We know who we have to protect. We know what reasonable precautions we have to take. Let's get our economy up and running again. And the media began to worship people like Andrew Cuomo and Gavin Newsom. And if you didn't go along with them and you didn't listen to Fauci, you weren't listening to the experts. But you went through a list of people from, last time I checked, pretty esteemed colleges and universities that had a difference of opinion. The media said no debate, no discussion, no split screens, no dueling experts. It's Fauci and Fauci alone.
Well, this is the problem they have now with Ron DeSantis. So it's the third most populous state in the union. It's got the second largest elderly population, and now it serves as a control group for the rest of the country. My home state of Iowa, my governor here, Kim Reynolds, also, she was the first state to reopen by gubernatorial decree. The first state to actually reopen was Wisconsin by a Supreme Court decree. She did it by her own hand. Brian Kemp in Georgia, he was accused of an exercise in human sacrifice, according to The Atlantic. And so we have all these U.S. control groups now. We have Sweden as a control group, which did almost none of the lockdown measures that the rest of the European Union did. And one of the great stats of the last year, Andrew, Sweden's excess death mortality in 2020 was 7% higher than its 4-year rolling average prior to COVID. The rest of the European Union, every other country in the EU, all did far greater draconian lockdowns. Their excess death mortality was 12 to 18% higher than the 4-year previous rolling average. And so we have these control groups now that show right now the hot spots in America are Michigan is #1, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania. Doesn't that sound familiar? They were the same hotspots we had last year, which certainly indicates an amount of seasonality to this. Or as Alex Berenson, the former New York Times reporter, says, the virus is good a virus. Our mitigation efforts this ham-fisted approach didn't work. We didn't save grandma. 95% of the people who have died were 50 or older. And then we have an obesity problem in the country. 80% of our hospitalizations, according to CDC, were people cataloged as morbidly obese. So we told them for a year, stay home, Netflix and chill, don't go outside, don't open the gyms, don't work out. I mean, this has just been preposterous policy from the beginning. It's the first time in human history ever, thousands of years of recorded history, we've had plagues. We've never quarantined the healthy before because it was dumb. And now that the data is coming in, it proves that this was dumb too.
All right, Steve, I got to leave it there. Congratulations on the book and the sales until the Bezos elves start messing with your sales numbers. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, brother. Take care.
All right, here we go. Time now for parting shots. And today's parting shot could easily be at President Joe Biden, but I'm going to move it over a little bit and make it at the people who find comfort in what he had to say about so-called ghost guns. If you haven't seen it, play that clip.
Want to rein in the proliferation of so-called ghost guns. These are guns that are homemade, built from a kit, that include directions on how to finish the firearm. You can go buy the kit. They have no serial numbers, so when they show up at a crime scene, they can't be traced. And the buyers aren't required to pass a background check to buy the kit, to make the gun. Consequently, anyone from a criminal to a terrorist can buy this kit in as little as 30 minutes, put together a weapon.
Okay, the issue here is home-based manufacturing and 3D printing. President Biden thinks by passing just another law, that's going to prevent violence in this country. Well, by that standard, we should just make murder illegal. It's not going to prevent anything. It's like declaring a school or a shopping mall a gun-free zone. Yeah, I was going to go murder a whole bunch of people, but I don't want to break the rules. And oops, I'm going to watch the grass as I walk back to my car to go home. This is not stopping anything. And you know what's amazing is we have people on the left who say, we don't know how to stop people crossing the border, but we want to go around confiscating guns. Well, it doesn't work that way. 3D printing is here and it's here to stay. People are going to be making gun parts and eventually whole guns at home. Making another law is not going to stop one murder. But this is false sense of security promotion here. People actually think if we just pass another law, if we stop these evil people from making guns, we'll lower the murder rate. Well, you don't need 3D printing to have a high murder rate. Look at Chicago. I can guarantee you the double-digit nightly body count has absolutely nothing to do with so-called ghost guns. It's not about the gun. It's about the person holding the gun. Understand now? We're right. They're wrong. That's the end of the story. The arguments on this television program cannot be broken. Make sure you catch me on SiriusXM Patriot, channel 125, noon to 3 East, 9 to noon West. From Washington, D.C., I'm Andrew Wilkow. Thank you for watching Blaze TV.